Kia ora. My name is Martin McMorrow. I'm from the Centre for Teaching and Learning at Massey University, and I'll be taking you through this short film which is designed to help you in writing your reflective journal. That's assignment 3 for your postgraduate paper on leading and changing organizations. And as you can see, we're going to look at the different parts of this assignment, starting off again with the question. And it's always a good idea to keep that question in your mind, and whenever you start doing some work on a question, whether that's research, planning or writing, you go back and have a look at the question. So take a look. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to read what we have, and then I'll say a few words about it. If you need some more time, just press pause and then you can read for a bit longer before you hear me talking about it some more. Okay, so as you can see, it's 3,000 words long, and my suggestion and the examples which I'm going to give you in this film are mostly paragraphs of about 200 words each. So that means that there are about 15 of them. So the introduction, I'm going to suggest a one paragraph introduction. Then you have these 3 vignettes. It just means 3 sections, and we're going to look at the structure of those in a moment, but I'm going to suggest about 4 paragraphs for each one. Okay, so there are 3 of them. It gives you 12 paragraphs in total. And then you have the conclusion, and I'm going to suggest you either write 2 paragraphs of 200 words each, or you write 3 paragraphs, and I'll be talking about the conclusion a little later. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the structure for you summarized. Basically, you'll see that that comes directly from the question that we've answered just now, and it takes time to think about examples, to do the research, to revise, to put it together. So it is important that, if possible, you begin this process early on in the semester, and it's at the back of your mind as much as possible. So we're going to start by looking at the introduction. As I've said, the example that I've given you is 1 paragraph. It's just an example. Of course, it's possible for you to divide it up into 2. There are different ways to write. But here I'm giving you an idea about the purpose of the introduction for this reflective journal. As you can see there, one element of an introduction to almost anything is that it gives the reader an idea of the purpose, what it's focusing on, and how it's structured. Okay, so that's one element, I think, of your introduction paragraph. As your journal is going to be made up of 3 parts, 3 vignettes, and each one of them is going to include a different personal experience of leadership, then it makes sense in the introduction to give an idea to the reader about how and why you've chosen to tell the reader about those particular 3 experiences, and perhaps also why you've put them in a certain order. And so the journal as a whole ought to be presenting the reader with a kind of story of your developing understanding and practice of leadership. And so giving the reader an idea of that can also be an element of your introduction. So as you can see here on the next part of this film, I've given you an example paragraph which I've written as part of a journal which I've done just to give an example of how to do these things. And it's been an interesting experience for me in thinking back on these real experiences that I've had, and then reading some of the literature which has been placed on the stream side for this course. Now, obviously, I'm not a management lecturer. I don't have any knowledge of management more than anyone else who's just walked into a classroom. So what I'm presenting you here are examples of writing style and structure for reflective journals. I've included content and ideas, of course, which are about leadership, but you shouldn't, of course, be thinking that those are right or good ideas about leadership, because that's not the purpose. And your learning about leadership is something you're doing in the course itself. Okay, this is all about writing this journal. Now, for these example paragraphs, I've placed a 1 minute pause for you. So again, if that's not enough, you can just press the pause again and give yourself more time. I'm just going to go on to say 1 or 2 things about this paragraph. So pause if you haven't already read it. The main thing here for you is to look at how this paragraph fulfills those 3 purposes of an introduction that I just mentioned. Okay, so you can see the first sentence there explains the main purpose of this journal. The next part talks about the structure of the journal and the choices which are made in terms of experience and in terms of order. Okay? So in the next part, we're going to have a look at an example of a vignette. And this is actually the first vignette in the example journal which I've written. Now, I'm suggesting that for each vignette there are 3 elements. The first element is like a little story about a particular experience of leadership. Remember, it can be an experience where you were in the position of leader, or an experience where you were part of a team. You experienced the leadership of somebody else. But remember that that should be at a personal level. You're not expected to write about some leader you've read about in a book or seen on TV, but someone who has been your leader. So I'm suggesting you write 1 paragraph about that, and I'm going to give you some more information about how to structure that story. In the second paragraph, I'm suggesting that you analyze that paragraph, that experience that you've just told the reader about. And in particular, you look at problems or questions which arise in relation to your understanding of leadership. So that's the first half of the vignette. The second half, I'm suggesting, should consist of scholarly critique. No more telling the story, but now looking at those problems and questions, as we say, through the lens of leadership theory or theories, using some of the ideas about leadership that you've been learning about during this course to understand what happened, and also to suggest some learning and possibly some alternative ways of leading which may be used in future or may have been used usefully in the example which you told us about in the story. Okay, so again we're going to have a look at an example of a vignette. So we'll start off with this picture which represents personal experience, and as you can see here, I've given you an example paragraph and I've highlighted the different elements of a story. Remember that a story of experience is more than just a situation. A story is something that happened, that has a beginning, a middle and an end. So I've coloured the different sentences in this paragraph to represent the different stages of this story. So again, take a few minutes if you like to read through and think about this story. Of course it's written in the past tense mostly, as it's a story. And it's important, obviously, that the story, as I've said, is about a personal experience of leadership. So, I'm going to now move on, but of course, if you want more time, you just press pause. Paragraph 2 of this is the analysis. And as you can see here, the analysis is intended to establish a perspective on the experience, to suggest possible causes and effects, and to raise questions and issues which are worth investigating further. So, take a look at this example paragraph, have a read, press pause if you want some time. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about it. Again, if you need more time, just press pause. Firstly, notice that the tense switches between past and present, okay, because in analysis you're looking back from the present. So in this example it's beginning with the past tense, but then in the middle we've got expressions like in retrospect, which means looking back, my story seems, and it makes me, and strikes me, convinces me. Okay, so those are the expressing my view of the story now as I remember it. Notice that there aren't answers here. The purpose of this analysis is to identify problems and questions, and there are some examples here of actually asking some direct questions, which can be the topics of the scholarly critique which is going to follow. So again, if you have any more if you want any more time, just press pause and read it a bit more. I'll move on to the second half of this vignette, which is scholarly critique. And as I mentioned earlier, the purpose here is to use the leadership ideas and theories that you've been learning about like a lens to look through as you examine the experience of leadership that you've told us about, and to explain how those ideas have maybe changed your understanding of your past experience of leadership. So there are 2 example paragraphs, because I'm suggesting that this should be about half of the vignette, so 2 of the 4 paragraphs. As you can see here, there are citations. I've just taken out my citations. It's not really relevant to you where I got these ideas from. You'll be using your own. But it is important that you show the reader, your lecturer, that you've done research and you're using this research and applying it to your experience. Okay, I'm not saying that you need 4 citations or 5 in each paragraph, but I'm showing you that it's possible. So again, if you want to spend a little longer reading this, please go ahead, press pause. We'll now show you the second paragraph. Again, take a moment to read through. Okay, I'll just say a couple of things about it. If you want more time, just press pause. Notice the switch from past to present again. A lot of this is about your present understanding, but we're imagining maybe a different way of leading in that experience in the past. So the grammar that we're using is mostly what we call third conditional. If you've ever studied a bit of English grammar, here's an example in the middle. If I had had, I might have, blah blah blah. Okay, and then towards the end we have may have been and may have inhibited. Okay, so those are ways of imagining a different past. Okay, so as you can see, that's the complete vignette. I'm now going to go on a little bit quicker to show you the second vignette in my example journal. Okay, so again, it's made up of these 3 parts, starting with a personal experience, then analysis, so that we can identify questions and problems, and then scholarly critique, where we can use theory, apply it to the experience, and discuss your learning and your ideas for different ways of leading and solving those management problems. Okay? Now, because this is the second vignette, we're expecting, I think, some continuity, some link to the first one. So notice that there are some expressions in each part which make a reference to the first vignette. They make a link or contrast or connection. Okay. So again, I'll give you some time to read through it. Here's the first paragraph of that story, what I suggest is if you can try and identify the different components of a story. Now, last time I highlighted those. This time I'm just giving you the paragraph. It's your job now to identify those 5 different elements of this story. Okay, so if you want more time, just press pause. Perhaps you went back to the earlier story to remind yourself of structure, but we have an opening situation or context, a problem, a response to that problem, an outcome, and an evaluation. In this case, the evaluation is compared to the earlier one, you see, unlike the previous experience, you see. So there's a kind of continuity, so that these 3 vignettes are not just completely independent. The second vignette is in a way continuing and adding to the first one. Okay, then we have the analysis paragraph. Again, the purpose is to identify problems and questions about leadership. So again, take a look through here. If you need more time, just press pause. Okay, so as I said earlier, there can be switching between past and present. Most of this is written in the past, but there is something in the middle here which is talking about general theory, so that is written in the present. You see, communication is. Every interaction builds, erodes, etc. Okay, but here most of the rest of it is in the past. But again, we have an example of a couple of questions coming up towards the end. So, the second half of the vignette is scholarly critique, using those theories to discuss what happened, to show your understanding and how your understanding has changed, and what practical ideas about leadership come from that growing understanding. So again, 2 paragraphs. Take a moment to read the first one here. I'll just remind you that these are some management and leadership ideas which I read about, but that doesn't mean that they're right or necessary for you to use. I've tried to avoid using the more common or better known management and leadership ideas, because those are the ones that you'll probably be using. So I've taken this idea that I found out about called loosely coupled organizations, and that's the particular theory that I'm applying here. But that doesn't mean that it's right or a great one to choose. It's just one which I've taken as an example. Okay, and remember here again we have some past tense to talk about what I did, but mostly present tenses to talk about the theory and how it applies to this kind of situation. In this first sentence of the second paragraph, I'm using a tense called present perfect. Has led me to. And present perfect tense, which is has done or have done, is a tense which we use to talk about change. So it's particularly useful in this kind of writing, and there are some more examples in all of these scholarly critique paragraphs. Okay, and I'm using the present tense to talk about my understanding of leadership. Sometimes I'm using words like now to emphasize the difference between what I understand now, having studied leadership, and my past understanding of what happened. And as I mentioned earlier, we have some of those kind of conditional phrases when we are thinking of an alternative way of having done something, in a way imaginary past. So a greater understanding could have allowed me, I could have used. Okay, so again, I'll give you a moment to continue reading that. Please press pause if you need a bit more time. We're going to just move on to the last part, which is the conclusion. I'm suggesting, as I mentioned earlier, either 2 or 3 paragraphs. The main point, which is written in your question, is to summarize your learning and how your understanding has changed, or what parts might have stayed the same. And here I'm giving you alternatives. One way with 2 paragraphs might be just to separate it into answers to those 2 questions. Or another way in which you could do it is to write 3 paragraphs and to talk about your understanding of leadership at 3 stages in your development, mentioning some of the questions and experiences which you've written about in the journal. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this short film. We've looked at the structure of the journal overall. We've looked at the structure of each vignette, and we've looked at the purpose of each of the paragraphs in that vignette, and some particular structures which are common when you're writing story, analysis, or critique. So, as I said at the beginning, my name is Martin McBorough. I'm working here at the Centre for Teaching and Learning. Thanks for taking time to look through this video today. Please take a chance to look